Welcome to the Paperboats podcast. My name's Ian Gross. I'm a researcher and writer, and like many people, I'm concerned about our deepening environmental crises. In each episode of this podcast, I'll be meeting with a different writer from the Paperboats collective. We'll discuss their work and the issues that they write about. Paperboats are a group of writers from across Scotland and beyond, inspired by Kathleen Jamie's poetic response to COP26. They're working together to highlight the impacts of climate change, the ecological collapse we are witness to, and the things we can do to help bring about positive change. If you're concerned about climate change, want to delve further into the issues surrounding it, and like great writing, follow and subscribe to the Paperboats podcast to hear from a host of fantastic nature writers. Hello, and thanks for joining us for episode 3 of the Paperboats podcast. And with me today is naturalist, not naturist, photographer, and wildly prolific nature writer, the wonderful Polly Pullar. Hi, Polly. How are you doing?
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. So just to introduce you fully to our listeners then, Polly. Polly is also a passionate wildlife rehabilitator specialising in the red squirrel and birds of prey. She's a long-standing columnist in numerous magazines, perhaps most notably the Scots magazine, and contributes regularly to the BBC Wildlife magazine. Her books include Fauna Scotica, Animals and People in Scotland, A Richness of Martins, Wildlife Tales from the Highlands, The Red Squirrel, A Future in the Forest, A Scurry of Squirrels, Naturing the Wild, A Drop in the Ocean, Lawrence McEwen and the Island of Muck, and her most recent, published in 2022, The Horizontal Oak, A Life in Nature. Polly is also co-founder and director of Right Highland Hoolie, which is Malig's annual book festival, and that's held every November. So do try and get to that next time it's on. So welcome again, Polly. I thought it might be useful to talk about where your nature writing comes from, if that makes sense, and begin with where you grew up in Ardnamurchan on the west coast of Scotland. Can you just give us an insight into how your relationship, your love for nature and nature writing, how that began, and your relationship with wildlife and how that relates to your writing now?
Well, I suppose I have my parents to thank for that, because both my parents were very, very keen on wildlife. And when I look back now, they were great supporters of the World Wildlife Fund. And I remember when I was very, very little, when we lived in England, that my mother got an artist to come and paint this amazing, all these animal murals. So there were pandas, there were lemurs, there were things that were threatened, parrots. My mother was mad on parrots, which is probably why I'm called Polly. And they had this charity event, a dance for the World Wildlife Fund. So I grew up in a house where, nature was very much to the fore, where we went out and noticed things, where my mother would sometimes bring in injured hedgehogs. And as a child, I desperately wanted to be a vet. I wanted to look after animals, and I just loved anything to do with wildlife. And then when we moved to Ardnamurchan and I went to the primary school there, I was allowed to be very feral, and I really thank my parents for that. They just let me free with all the other children. And I spent my days guddling in rock pools, exploring, damming up the burns, collecting shells, in all bad weather and everything. And nobody ever worried about where I was. And we learned to deal with all the dangers that there were by just respect and understanding. And every day I saw something amazing, whether it was just my passion for red deer, which began very early on, the otters on the beach, the wonderful buzzards, the golden eagles. And at that time, towards the end of the 1960s, we still had wildcats. And I used to see wildcats quite regularly. So that love of nature started very, very early. And I also spent a lot of my childhood with shepherds, stalkers, crofters, helping in sheep fanks, going out when they were culling the red deer sometimes, from a very early age. And that really was a fantastic grounding for what was to become a way of life.
It sounds absolutely idyllic. but I know from your recent memoir, The Horizontal Oak, that there was a more troubling side to that upbringing in Ardnamurchan. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, of course. So my parents bought the Kilhoen Hotel in Ardnamurchan, and my mother was very clever in a way because she had managed up to that point when they moved to Ardnamurchan when I was 6 years old. She had managed to largely protect me from the fact that my father was a very, very serious alcoholic. But of course, when they wanted to move away from Liverpool, where my dad was a timber merchant. He'd inherited a timber merchant's business and he hated it. And they decided that everything was getting built up and they wanted to come back to Scotland, which is where they were really originally from.
Oh, okay.
And they bought this hotel. But for dad, that was a disaster
Yeah.
because alcoholics and also hotels and also long, dark, wet winters in Ardnamurchan are not great. And so things deteriorated, and he and my mother then separated. So while my mother stayed in Ardnamurchan and remarried the person who owned Ardnamurchan estate, who became my wonderful stepfather, my father deteriorated more and more and more. And I wrote about that, as you mentioned, in the
Hmm.
Horizontal Oak. So I wanted to also highlight the fact that everybody has some problems, troubles,
Yeah.
family problems, and the fact that I was allowed such a feral childhood, I always found great solace by being outside, by walking, by being in nature, even if it was just watching something very small that was very minute sort of happening in the garden. That was enough to take your mind off things that were
Yeah.
troubling.
Oh,
It's always been at the root of everything, really.
thanks for your honesty, and I mean, I know you've been very open and honest in the memoir, but thanks for sharing that. So, nature has obviously been, a driving force in your life, and obviously a comfort through that difficult time. And
Yes, it has indeed. And when Dad, in the end, when I was in my early 20s, he took his own life.
okay.
And so my parents had long been separated by that time. So there was that to deal with. And it was quite a few years after that terrible incident that I began to really suffer and feel it. And there was anxiousness and various problems. But again, the fact that I was able to get out in nature and write about what I loved best, it really, really helped. So again, that was another major reason for writing the book, because I wanted to give people
Hmm.
hope. Because actually, suicide now is so much more prevalent.
Yeah, as is anxiety, and I've suffered from anxiety myself, and I
Yeah, me
found that,
too.
yeah, that just getting outside and connecting in a more natural environment is really helpful.
I mean, we've now got eco anxiety,
Yeah,
haven't we?
yeah.
The trouble is now I try not to highlight it too much, but the very thing that brought me solace is now bringing me extra worries because,
Mm.
as habitat and nature collapses all around us, you realize that that's another major thing that keeps you awake at night.
Yeah, I mean that's the double-edged sword of it. You connect with nature to find comfort and sort of recenter yourself, and then when you connect with it, you start to care about it, and when you care about it, then yeah,
Stuff
yeah,
hurt, doesn't it?
inevitably start worrying about it. Yeah. So going back to that, you mentioned squirrels there in your childhood, and I know that's a big passion of yours, and the plight of squirrels, the red squirrel in particular, and I know you're also deeply concerned over the decline in hedgehogs and the involvement in the movement to reintroduce beavers to our landscape. And I know you're the ambassador of the Beaver Trust. And elsewhere in your writing, I've read, you said, we need action for there is no more time, to quoting you there. But can you talk a little about each of those, species that are at the centre of your concern and some of the issues that surround them?
Well, red squirrels, if we start with that, is quite a fascinating subject because now I think you and I would both agree that the red squirrel is probably the only wild animal that is actually on a pedestal and never falls off that pedestal. It is
Hmm.
always up there. Everybody thinks red squirrels are heavenly. Everybody wants them in their lives. Everyone wants to introduce them and see them. And people go mad for red squirrels more than probably almost any other species in the UK.
Hmm.
But it wasn't like that. people used to cull red squirrels in huge numbers. They were perceived as a threat to ground nesting birds and to forestry. Humans are so fickle. And so I feel that the fact that we've changed our attitudes to red squirrels, then I'm very much hope that we can change them for other species. And you mentioned beavers.
Yeah.
And beavers are incredibly exciting because they're a new species. We have no cultural memory of them. And in various camps, people are getting really troubled by them and troubled in how to handle them. And so the minor bit of work that I do is to really communicate with the people who have problems. I think the main problem with a lot of our wildlife issues is that the two sides remain defiant and don't communicate.
Yeah.
And I think that achieves nothing. So I hope one day that our attitudes to beavers will change.
Can you outline some of those attitudes, some of the negative attitudes towards them?
Yes, I mean, there are people who just absolutely adore beavers, and if you are very open, you can and you see the work they do. I mean, I go to Banff, which is near Alyth, and I've seen over the last 10, 15 years the development and the expansion of nature there in that place. It has become quite incredible, the amount of species. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I know that the invertebrates have improved. There's enormous numbers of things like that, amphibians, frogs, toads, moths, butterflies, and it all because of the fact that the beaver is creating this absolutely incredible environment. And so on that hand, that's wonderful. But farmers who are now forced often, in many cases, to become more and more and more intensive and forced to produce more from smaller areas are not leaving enough space for nature. And I don't blame the farmers in many cases. I think in many cases it's because of the government and the way things are squeezed and the fact that there are so many more humans on the planet. But the trouble is hating beavers and blaming beavers for all the things that are happening. Ironically, they often blame beavers for serious flooding, and the beaver's just now becoming a scapegoat. And that worries me because I think, yes, there are places where beavers cause trouble. There is no doubt about that. But there is mitigation, and people can help. And as I say all the time, as soon as you stop communicating and listening to both sides, then we achieve absolutely nothing. And I think we have to give beavers a bit more time. When they cull beavers illegally, all that happens is they create a void in which more beavers come in, and those new beavers will start to fell trees frenetically to build up their own territory. And so it goes on, whereas it's sort of almost better the beaver you know than the beaver you don't. So if you live with the ones that are causing what these farmers perhaps or landowners see as damage, things will settle down. But it's very hard because people are
Yeah.
pressured, and farmers will say they need to produce food, which of course is true. And the trouble is, it seems to be there's less and less money for nature, and that is really where the input should be. But because if we get nature right, other things will fall into place. But
Yeah.
it's very hard to persuade the naysayers of that hard fact, And if people are dyed in the wool and don't believe that, you have one heck of an uphill struggle. It's like pushing a wheelbarrow of cement through a bog uphill with a wonky wheel. It's a job trying to persuade them, and there are some people you just really won't ever persuade. But
No, I guess
for all that, to listen.
and people dig in, don't they? And if they feel threatened or that a practice is threatened, they immediately become more defensive. And so it's
right.
really tricky to open up that dialogue, isn't it? And I suppose that's where you as a writer can come in and perhaps help to bridge that gap, to help encourage conversation. Would you say that's true?
I think so, and I think we should be ambassadors as well and listen. I think listening is so important. And you mentioned hedgehogs, and that's an interesting one too, because people used to hate hedgehogs too. I mean, they've frequently featured on gamekeepers' gibbets. They were killed because of eating eggs, pheasants' eggs, and things like that. And sadly now, I hear an awful lot of people blaming badgers for culling hedgehogs and for the loss of hedgehogs. And I would never, as a naturalist, I would never say that badgers don't kill hedgehogs, because of course they do. But if the environment was right, the two species that have coexisted for so many hundreds of years would be okay. But it's in the name. The clue is in the name. Hedgehogs. They've
Yes.
lost edges, and that
Yeah.
doesn't help. And these massive fluctuations in temperature, that's when I receive lots of hedgehogs. They just simply cannot cope with the fact that one day it's 25, 30 degrees, and then within the space of 24 hours, the temperature can plummet to single figures again.
Yeah.
How can are we so like that? They're
Oh,
also waking up in the middle of hibernation, which is really not a good thing in the depths of winter. I mean, some hedgehogs do wake up and just have a quick snack and go back to bed. But on the whole, that's really unusual. They should have their good long winter sleep, and now that's just not happening. I'm getting them in January and February and
okay.
March, wandering about, painfully thin, and 95% of them die. We seem to dig a lot of holes these days.
Yeah, I
It's
was
very
reading
hard.
that there's 50% less hedgehogs since the year 2000. They've reduced by 50% in that time,
Terrifying.
in the rural environment anyway, and a bit less in the urban
Mm.
environment. What do you think people can do apart from that dialogue and listening? On a sort of practical level, is there anything people that are concerned about hedgehogs in particular, because they were once so common, they were sort of a common part of our everyday lives, weren't they? But much less so now. What can they do to help
Well,
them?
it's really difficult because I mean, humans now have this awful tidy mentality, and I have been guilty of it in the past too. Now people come to my garden and go sort of make little comments like, "Gosh, we're a bit overgrown" and things like that. But I think, if you drive around the countryside, you'll see that some councils are being brilliant and leaving roadside verges, and I'm talking about verges where there's no issue with sight lines for traffic. But this frenetic cutting, we're always out trimming and mowing,
Mm.
and that's horrendous for hedgehogs and things. We use weed killers, and we use slug pellets. Some slug pellets are perfectly okay to use because they don't cause trouble. But hedgehogs need all the things that we are killing, and so we need to just become much less tidy. And if we see hedgehogs out through the day, that's wrong. They shouldn't be out in the day. So that indicates there's something seriously wrong. And ways we can help with that are either trying to put food out for them, food and water, not milk. There are many, many hedgehog uh, centres where people can take things that are struggling. Those are the ways we can help. But I think the
Mm.
biggest way we can help is by being less tidy.
Yes, yeah, being allowing our gardens to become a bit wilder, a bit messier.
A lot wilder.
Yeah, and allowing perhaps I know that fences are a barrier, roads are a barrier.
Yeah.
It's clear that I know you're involved in rehabilitation. You actively hands-on help to rehabilitate animals. But I'd like to move on now, maybe to your wonderful piece in the first issue, the Paperboats Zine, that focused on the gannet and a visit to the colony at Troop Head and an experience in Shetland. And you're going to read from that for us in a moment. And just wondered if you could give us a little bit of background about the piece, a bit, and then we can enjoy your reading.
Thank you. Well, I'm a bit funny because people will say to me, "What's your favorite bird? What's your favorite animal?" And basically, the answer to that is my favorite thing is what I happen to be watching at that moment. I just am passionate about so many animals and birds, all our wildlife, really, from spiders to everything, absolutely everything. I just love to study any of it. But gannets have definitely always had a very, very big piece of my heart. If I was asked, would I rather go to a gannet colony or to see puffins? And most people would say puffins, and I would say gannets. They are the most awe-inspiring birds. And to be in a gannet colony is probably one of the biggest, most wonderful wildlife things you can possibly do in this country. Um, and we're very, very lucky to have some absolutely fabulous gannet colonies.
Mhm.
And I think providing you're not causing any stress by going there, then they are wonderful places to experience nature in the raw and the excitement of the breeding season and the noise and the smell and everything. So I have a sort of annual mission to go to a couple of gannet colonies, and I've been doing it now for some years. But bird flu, avian influenza really caused absolute mayhem in these colonies, and that was very heartbreaking. So I was very inspired to write about gannets, but I was also inspired to write about them with regard to climate change,
Yeah.
because there's no doubt about it, climate change is really affecting gannets in particular, as it is with most of our seabirds. So that was really how this piece came about. This year has been my Solan Goose Summer. It's a vernacular name that suits the gannet well. I have spent time at Troop Head and in Shetland, the islands of eternal summer daylight. In Shetland, simmer dim and unprecedented heat brought perfect opportunities to spend time among gannets at our most northern nature reserve, Hermanus, and in a boat beneath the great sea-girt bastions of Nos. Seeing gannets on this scale transported me back to my first life-changing sighting of the massive sea stacks, Stackley and Stackenarman, St Kilda's extraordinary gannetries. Then, from the bow of a tall ship, my son and I watched thousands of gannets through rainbows of sunlit squalls, shining, plunging, drifting on the water, and filling the sky with racket and aroma. Being close to gannets floors me. When my son was little, there was a glorious visit to Bass Rock. Gannets left their brilliance on him too. His pencil drawings with notes are on my study wall. Gannets are like masked bandits compared to other birds. On Shetland, swathes of swirling maritime fog mingled with gannets' clamouring cacophony. Plunging with lethal precision, they erupted with fish through fizzing foam and froth. The collective noun for gannets is apt, a plunging. We cruised close to vertiginous cliffs layered with birds at all levels, apricot tinging their heads and lines on their webbed feet, acid yellow or turquoise, as they watched us through mesmerizing iceberg blue eyes. A sinister strand to the story is that those birds that have survived avian influenza, HPA, may now have dark irises. No one fully understands the physiological changes that are taking place, nor whether they will retain their sight. Gannets are ambassadors for the plight of seabirds. Ongoing climate change is forcing them to travel further and further in search of prey, forcing them to leave their nests for extended periods. On average, birds may be traveling over 300 kilometers, and there are numerous records of them traveling even greater distances. Bonds to their single chicks and mates are so strong that they fly faster to return to avert disaster. But how can a gannet continue to increase its speed and supplement the extra energy required in fish fuel if there are few fish? How can global fish stocks recover if we continue to sit back and do nothing to halt climate change and overfishing? If that single egg or chick fails because the sitter is late back, no more will be forthcoming until the following year. Being largely pelagic, many of a gannet's struggles occur far from human eyes. It can seem that all is well. The marine environment is becoming more treacherous, and our sea life is vulnerable to a frightening list of pollutants, disturbance, and habitat loss, entirely caused by us. Tempestuous storms are increasingly frequent, and temperature extremes fluctuate dangerously within hours. Wildlife cannot adapt. A gannet passes me carrying a piece of vibrant polypropylene in its bill, nest material to impress its mate. Many seabirds are using human detritus to their detriment. The outcome is seldom good. Strident calls reach a crescendo as the strength of the salt breeze triggers a spectacular flypast. Hundreds of gannets play in the air currents, Subtle movements of perfectly preened feathers guide massive wings as they cruise the thermals. Oh, so close to me. A bird stares straight at me through one blue and one black eye. These eyes tell a story. It has survived HPA. But what will its fate be if we cannot conquer our warming climate? Nature can live without us, but we cannot live without nature. We can continue to tell ourselves there is still time, but that time has already run dry. The skylark's eulogies will become swan songs, and then they will cease.
Thank you, Polly. What an evocative piece of writing on a bird that I think is probably not as popular as some. And you bring the gannet to life here and really advocate for the animal. And the closing image of the bird with one black eye and one blue eye, that was also, it was a very powerful image. Because as you highlight with the climate change, which is the common thread here, isn't it, with all these animals that you're advocating for, something like avian flu it can push them over the brink, can't it? And I know that
The thing about gannets is over the years, I've worked with the SSPCA and volunteered and things, and I've gone onto beaches and cleared gannets out of ghost fishing gear and nets and all oil and everything. And the thing about them is that they fight to the death and they are so feisty, and I've always admired that. But when avian flu hit them, all that fight went out of them, and it made me just look more into their lives and to see just how incredibly vulnerable everything is.
How critical that our gannet, the gannet population in Britain, say northern Britain, how critical is that population now?
I think this summer when I was back in Shetland again, and we were looking, there was certainly a lot less of the younger birds, what we call the club sites, where young birds that are not ready to mate. So for the first 4 or 5 years, gannets don't mate, but they spend a lot of time, a little bit like teenagers on a street corner, flirting and sorting themselves out, and there's all that sort of thing going on. That I noticed was there were far, far fewer. I think gannets are recovering a bit, but I really can't give you the figures because I think that's more scientific, and it's very, very difficult to stand on a cliff and say there, how many there are. I noticed there were many less, but I had other people that I bumped into in Shetland, and they said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Aren't there a lot of gannets?" But I think again, it's a shifting baseline thing. Unless you're going often, you don't really know how many there should be. I mean, people often now say, "Oh, there's plenty of birds," but if I look back 30 years ago, there would be many, many more.
Yeah, it's a false sense of security in a way. If you see a large number of birds, you think, "Oh, there's loads, everything's fine." But as you highlighted, about the pressure that they're under, having to go further and further afield to get food. There's a lot going on that we don't see as that piece really.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Highlights.
And I mean, things like kestrels, I used to 40 years ago, 30 years ago, I used to have kestrels handed in all the time. I can't tell you when I've had the last one now.
Okay.
They've really declined massively.
Oh, isn't that? Because again, the perception I think is that birds of prey are back with the red kite in particular being such a success.
I think they're doing okay.
So it's interesting to hear that. So, just to close, then perhaps you've had 4 decades of professional work as a nature writer and photographer, and you've been active throughout that time in wildlife conservation and restoration. So I just wondered if there were any key. I mean, you've highlighted the key moment there, perhaps, but if there are any key moments or turning points during that career that stand out for you.
Oh gosh, so many. So many. I think one of the highlights for me is always going into primary schools. And sounds funny, but to see the work that goes on in primary schools and the fact that these little children, like little sponges, are so knowledgeable and so switched on, and you think, if these children, if we can just keep channeling them, they are our future, and they hold of everything. And when I go into those schools, I just think how vitally important it is that we look after nature as never before. But highlights, I've had so many. Visiting gannet colonies is definitely a highlight, and perhaps my biggest highlight of the whole lot, thinking now on my feet, whether I didn't know you were going to ask this, you Neville, is probably the night that I landed in St Kilda, when there was a full moon over Village Bay, and I stood leaning on the cleats, listening to dozens, and I mean dozens, of snipe drumming in June. Oh, that is probably the most, it was just too much for the soul to bear. It was so beautiful. So that to me sums up so much how important it is for us to care for nature as never before.
What a beautiful image to close with, I think, and an important message to close with as well. And long may experiences like that still be possible. So, Polly, thanks so much for a wonderful reading.
Thank you. That was excellent. Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I heard the beautiful promises, and sure I'm a river, but I can take a side. From this day I'd rather keep afloat like wee folded paper boats, the hopes of the young folk chanting at my bank, fear in their spring bright eyes. So hear this, fail them and I will rise.
Paperboats supports Global Justice Now and the Scottish Rewilding Alliance. To learn more about their campaigns and Paperboats writers, go to paperboats.org.